Welcome to Lady Mythos. Inside the desert at Saqqara, archaeologists entered a forgotten Egyptian pyramid, expecting to find prayers for the dead. Instead, they found instructions for a king to hunt the gods, slaughter them, and consume their power. The deeper they translated the walls, the worse the story became. Because this was not written as punishment. It was written as resurrection. More than 4,000 years ago, someone carved a vision of the afterlife so violent and strange that historians still struggle to explain what they were looking at. A dead pharaoh rising into the heavens, gods fleeing in panic, celestial beings dragged across the sky like prey. And at the center of it all stood Pharaoh Unas, a forgotten ruler from ancient Egypt, whose pyramid preserved one of the strangest texts in Egyptian mythology. Not one of Egypt's greatest rulers, not a famous conqueror, not even the builder of the largest pyramid. And yet, hidden beneath his tomb survived one of the darkest religious texts ever discovered. A passage from the ancient pyramid texts, later called the Cannibal Hymn. The name alone sounds impossible. Because when most people imagine ancient Egypt, they picture golden masks, sacred temples, careful burial rites, and priests trying to guide the dead safely into eternity. But this text describes something entirely different. A king who does not ask the gods for mercy. A king who takes immortality by force. And strangely, the Cannibal Hymn may not have been the most frightening part of Unas's pyramid. That is the mystery at the heart of this story. Was Unas really imagined as a cannibal king? Was this a symbolic ritual about absorbing divine power? Or did this hymn preserve something older, darker, and more frightening from the deepest layers of Egyptian belief? Because the more you look at it, the less it feels like a simple myth. It feels like a fear. A fear that death was not the end. A fear that something worse than death was waiting. Oblivion. To the ancient Egyptians, being dead was not the true nightmare. The true nightmare was being erased. Losing your name, losing your body, losing your soul's power, failing to become an eternal being. And maybe that is why this text is so extreme. Maybe the dead king had to become terrifying because the thing he feared was even worse. Imagine the first people stepping into that chamber with lamps in their hands. The air is dry, the walls are tight. The stone is covered from floor to ceiling in hieroglyphs. At first, it looks like a miracle of preservation. Ancient words still standing after more than 4,000 years. Then, the translation begins. A line about the king rising. A line about the heavens shaking. A line about gods being seized. A line about divine flesh prepared for him. The deeper they translated the walls, the worse the story became. And yet, this was not chaos. It was not madness scratched into stone. It was ordered, ritualized, placed exactly where the dead king needed it. As if the pyramid itself was not only a tomb, but a machine built to transform a human ruler into something impossible to kill. That is what makes Unas different. His pyramid does not simply ask what happens after death. It asks what a person might become if they refused to disappear. Before we descend further, subscribe to the channel, and if you enjoy the video, don't forget to like and share with your like-minded friends, because this story gets stranger with every chamber we enter. We are not just looking at a dark Egyptian myth. We are looking at a king standing at the edge of death, reaching into the heavens and deciding that survival was not enough. He wanted power. He wanted eternity. And if the gods stood in his way, the Cannibal Hymn says they would become part of him. And hidden in the center of the pyramid was a question historians still argue about today. Chapter 1. Unas, the Forgotten Pharaoh. Long before the Cannibal Hymn became one of the most debated texts in ancient history, there was only a king nearing the end of his life, an aging ruler in an aging kingdom. The world around Unas was changing, though few people living beneath the Egyptian sun could fully see it yet. For centuries, the pharaohs of the Old Kingdom had ruled like living gods. Their pyramids rose over the desert like artificial mountains. Their priests controlled vast temples. Their names were tied directly to the sun itself. Egypt had become rich, stable, and terrifyingly powerful. But by the time Unas came to the throne, small cracks had already begun spreading through that world. The great age of pyramid building was slowing. Royal authority no longer felt untouchable. Power was drifting away from the king and into the hands of nobles and priesthoods, growing richer every year. Even the massive sun temples built by earlier rulers were beginning to fade beneath wind and sand. And standing in the middle of that uncertain world was a pharaoh most people today barely remember. Unas was not a legendary conqueror. He was not a warrior king marching across continents. No great military campaigns made his name immortal. No giant empire spread beneath his feet. Compared to rulers like Khufu or Ramses, Unas almost feels quiet, distant, overshadowed. That is part of what makes this story so unsettling. Because nothing about Unas suggested his tomb would contain something this terrifying. His pyramid itself was smaller than many that came before it. Even at Saqqara, surrounded by older monuments and broken royal tombs, it did not dominate the desert skyline. Time wore its outer stones away until much of it collapsed into rough layers of weathered rubble. But beneath that damaged shell, hidden deep underground, something extraordinary waited. The burial chambers of Pharaoh Unas became the first ancient Egyptian pyramid ever completely covered in pyramid texts. Not painted, not written on papyrus, carved directly into stone. Thousands of hieroglyphs stretching across the walls like eternal instructions for the dead. And unlike many older monuments destroyed by tomb robbers, erosion, or later construction, much of Unas's inscriptions survive. It is strange to think about. A relatively forgotten king became the accidental guardian of one of humanity's oldest surviving religious archives. Almost as if history preserved him for one reason alone: to carry this text forward. At night, Saqqara must have felt endless. Cold desert wind moving between pyramids, jackals wandering near abandoned tombs, priests carrying oils, incense, and funerary tools through narrow corridors lit only by flickering flame. Somewhere beneath the stone, Unas lay prepared for eternity. His body wrapped carefully in linen, his organs removed and sealed away. His tomb filled with ritual objects, offerings, carved formulas, and sacred protections designed to help him survive the journey waiting beyond death. Because survival after death was never guaranteed in ancient Egypt. That is one of the most important things to understand. The Egyptians did not believe immortality happened automatically. The soul could weaken. A spirit could become lost. A name could vanish from memory. And if that happened, a person might dissolve into nothing. Not fire, not punishment, erasure. That fear sat beneath almost every funerary ritual the Egyptians ever created. It explains the food offerings left for the dead, the preservation of the body, the endless prayers, the carefully carved names. Everything existed to prevent disappearance. And during Unas's reign, that fear may have become even stronger. Because Egypt itself no longer felt eternal. The old order was aging. The golden age was dimming. You can almost imagine the atmosphere surrounding the final years of the 5th dynasty. Priests whispering in temple halls, nobles gaining confidence, royal certainty beginning to crack for the first time in generations. In moments like that, religions often become more intense, more desperate, more extreme. And hidden beneath Unas's pyramid, the afterlife was no longer described as peaceful. The texts began transforming the dead king into something dangerous. Not merely divine, something hungry. As archaeologists later studied the inscriptions, many noticed how different these texts felt compared to the softer funerary traditions that came afterward. There was violence here, predation, cosmic domination. The king was not preparing to stand humbly before the gods. He was preparing to confront them, to overpower them, possibly even to absorb them. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Cannibal Hymn was preserving fragments of a far older belief system? Something older than the polished religion most people associate with ancient Egypt. Something raw from the earliest days of kingship, when survival after death was imagined as a struggle instead of a judgment. Because the deeper we move into Unas's pyramid, the stranger the texts become. The walls begin describing transformations no human should survive. The heavens start trembling. The gods begin fleeing, and before long, the dead king is no longer acting like a man at all. But the real horror wasn't Unas himself. It was what the priests believed he could become after death. Chapter 2. The first words inside the pyramid. The deeper archaeologists moved beneath Unas's pyramid, the stranger the atmosphere became. The desert heat disappeared behind them. The sounds of the outside world faded. Only narrow corridors remained ahead, lined with ancient stone and air untouched for thousands of years. And then, the walls began to speak. Torchlight moved slowly across the chambers, revealing rows of hieroglyphs carved so precisely they still seemed alive. Every inch of stone was covered in sacred writing. No empty spaces, no decoration for beauty alone. The walls themselves had become part of the ritual. At first, nobody fully understood what they were looking at. This was not a normal tomb. Before Unas, Egyptian pyramids had been mostly silent inside. Massive monuments on the outside, but hidden chambers within them remained largely bare. Unas changed that. His pyramid became the first royal tomb where the burial chambers were completely covered with religious inscriptions. Today, those writings are known as the pyramid texts, the oldest major funerary writings from ancient Egypt. And they are some of the oldest surviving religious texts in human history. Older than many biblical writings, older than most surviving Greek myths, older than nearly every religious tradition still known today. That alone makes the pyramid extraordinary. But the purpose of these texts was even stranger. The Egyptians did not carve them into stone simply to honor the dead king. They believed the words themselves possessed power, real power. The kind of power that could protect a soul, open gates in the underworld, command divine beings, and prevent the dead from falling into oblivion. In other words, the pyramid texts were not poetry. They were technology. Resurrection technology. Many historians consider the pyramid texts of Unas to be the foundation of later ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs. Every spell, every line, every sacred phrase had a purpose. Some guided the king through the underworld. Others protected his body from decay. Some allowed him to breathe again, eat again, or rise into the heavens among the stars. Many of the inscriptions sound almost calm at first. Prayers to the gods, invocations to the sun, promises of rebirth. But buried among them was something completely different. A set of passages, later labeled Utterances 273 and 274. The Cannibal Hymn, one of the most debated passages in Egyptian mythology. Even modern Egyptologists paused when translating those sections for the first time, because the tone suddenly changes. Violently. The king is no longer presented as a fragile soul needing protection. He becomes aggressive, dominant, almost predatory. And unlike most funerary writings from the ancient world, these inscriptions do not ask the gods for mercy. Most funerary texts begged the gods for mercy. This one threatened them. That is what makes the Cannibal Hymn feel so unsettling, even today. The shift is immediate. One moment, the pyramid speaks like a sacred tomb. The next, it speaks like a warning. Imagine standing inside that chamber while the translations slowly emerged, line by line. Dust drifting through torchlight. Ancient symbols glowing against limestone walls. A translator quietly reading aloud words untouched for more than 4,000 years. Then suddenly, the sky trembles. The gods are afraid. The king feeds upon them. You can almost imagine the silence that must have followed those first translations. Because this was not how ancient religion was supposed to sound. There are moments in history where a text feels older than the civilization that preserved it. The Cannibal Hymn feels like one of those moments. As if hidden beneath the polished religion of dynasties and temples, something far more primal had survived. Something tied to fear, to power, to survival at any cost. Some scholars later suggested the hymn may preserve fragments of extremely ancient royal beliefs, possibly reaching back to a time before Egyptian religion became more ordered and ceremonial. Others argued the language was symbolic, a dramatic ritual transformation meant to show the king absorbing divine power. But even symbolic readings do not remove the violence from the text. If anything, they make it stranger. Because the hymn does not describe a man eating flesh for hunger, it describes a ruler consuming divinity itself. And the pyramid treats that transformation as necessary. That is the detail that keeps haunting historians. Why would a king need to become this dangerous after death? Why did immortality require domination? Why did eternity demand violence? As the translations continued, the answers only became darker. The king was not merely entering heaven, he was preparing to take it. And the deeper the inscriptions went, the more active the transformation became. The dead ruler was no longer resting in his tomb. He was moving, ascending, changing into something the living could barely understand. By this point, the walls no longer felt like funerary inscriptions. They felt like instructions for unleashing a force. And then, the texts described the dead king rising into the sky, armed for a hunt. Chapter 3: The King Who Hunted the Gods. The Cannibal Hymn does not begin quietly. It explodes into motion. The moment the dead king rises, the universe itself reacts. The sky shakes. The stars tremble. The ancient texts describe the heavens roaring, as if something unnatural has entered them. The gods do not welcome Unas into eternity. They panic. That detail changes everything. Because Egyptian funerary religion usually follows a clear pattern. The dead king is guided, protected, purified, and accepted among the divine powers of the cosmos. But the Cannibal Hymn describes something far more dangerous. The gods are not waiting for Unas. They are trying to escape him. Imagine the scene the priests were trying to create inside the mind of the dead ruler. Darkness breaking apart above the pyramid. Clouds twisting over celestial waters. Stars moving like living creatures across the night sky. And rising beneath them is the spirit of the king, no longer fully human. This is where the transformation truly begins. The hymn describes Unas ascending into the heavens like a force of nature. Some translations compare him to a raging bull filled with unstoppable power. Others describe him moving among the gods with terrifying authority, stronger even than those who gave him life. The language becomes increasingly violent with every line. not symbolic in the soft modern sense, physical, active, immediate. In one of the darkest stories from Egyptian mythology, the dead king becomes the hunter. That is one of the strangest aspects of the entire text. The afterlife is not described as a peaceful paradise. It becomes a vast, celestial wilderness filled with prey. The gods of ancient Egypt themselves become prey. The ancient Egyptians often connected marshes and reed fields with the afterlife. In many funerary beliefs, the blessed dead hoped to reach beautiful eternal fields where food was endless and suffering disappeared. But in the Cannibal Hymn, those heavenly regions feel transformed into hunting grounds. Celestial marshes stretch beneath strange stars. Divine beings move through them like animals trying to hide. And somewhere in the darkness, hunters are already moving. Ghostly figures carrying ropes and lassos cross the heavens beside the king. The hymn describes gods being captured, restrained, and dragged away. Some are seized while trying to flee across the sky itself. It is difficult to overstate how unusual this imagery is. This is not a king proving himself worthy before the gods. This is a king asserting dominance over them. The dead king did not enter heaven peacefully. He entered like a predator. Among all surviving ancient Egyptian texts, few scenes feel as violent as this. That line may be the single most important idea in the entire hymn. Because by this point, Unas is no longer behaving like a mortal ruler seeking protection after death. He is becoming something else entirely. A cosmic hunter. A devourer of divine power. A being willing to cross boundaries other Egyptian texts rarely even approach. And the deeper the hymn goes, the more unstable the universe begins to feel. The sky itself seems alive. Constellations move like frightened witnesses. The gods scatter in confusion. Some later scholars believe the text intentionally creates this chaos to show the king surpassing ordinary cosmic order. Others thought it preserved fragments of much older royal rituals tied to hunting and sacrifice. But regardless of interpretation, the imagery remains startlingly vivid. You can almost picture it unfolding above the desert. Unas rising from his tomb beneath Saqqara, the stars bending around him, sacred beings fleeing through the heavens. Invisible ropes tightening around divine throats. There is one especially disturbing idea hidden beneath all this movement. The hymn never describes the king as evil. That is important. The text treats this hunt as necessary, legitimate, sacred. The priests who carved these words into stone were not warning against Unas. They were empowering him. That realization changes the mood of the entire pyramid, because suddenly the burial chamber no longer feels like a place of mourning. It feels like preparation. Preparation for an ascent so violent that heaven itself must reorganize around the arrival of the king. And strangely, the hymn suggests the gods are not entirely helpless. Some resist, some flee, some attempt to hide among the stars. But escape becomes impossible. The hunters continue moving across the sky. The lassos tighten. the prey is gathered. And then, the text introduces a terrifying new detail. The captured gods are not simply defeated, they are being prepared for something. Something ritualized, something carefully organized. By this point, the Cannibal Hymn no longer feels like ordinary religion. It feels ancient in a way that is difficult to explain. Older than temples, older than kingship itself. As if beneath the polished surface of Egyptian civilization, the memory of a far more brutal sacred world had survived. A world where power was consumed. Literally or symbolically, the result was the same. The dead king was becoming stronger with every god brought before him, and the heavens were running out of places to hide. If you are still with me, subscribe and keep descending deeper into the pyramid, because the next part of the hymn is where even modern historians become uncomfortable. The hunt was only the beginning, because someone else was waiting for the captured gods, and their job was far worse. Chapter 4: The Hidden Rituals of the Afterlife. The hunt ends in a place no one expects. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not a divine court where the king finally claims victory. The captured gods are taken somewhere far stranger. A celestial kitchen. And this is the moment where the Cannibal Hymn becomes almost impossible to forget. Because once the gods are captured, the text begins describing what happens to them in terrifying detail. The sky is no longer filled with pursuit. The movement slows. The ritual begins. Ancient assistants appear beside the king, each carrying out a specific task. One binds the captured gods, another guards them, another drags them forward. Knives appear, fires are prepared, cauldrons are heated beneath the heavens themselves. And standing among these figures is one of the strangest gods in ancient Egyptian mythology, Shesmu. Even by Egyptian standards, Shesmu feels unsettling. He was associated with wine, oil, blood, execution, and ritual slaughter. Some texts describe him pressing the heads of the wicked like grapes in a winepress. Others portray him as both a provider and destroyer, a divine figure tied to transformation through violence. In the Cannibal Hymn, Shesmu becomes something even darker, a butcher of the gods themselves. The imagery inside the pyramid becomes shockingly physical. The gods are seized, bound, cut apart, cooked. Some translations describe great cauldrons boiling beneath the sky, while divine bodies are prepared for the dead king. Others describe the older gods being consumed for their ancient magic, while younger gods are devoured for vitality and strength. It sounds monstrous, but the deeper meaning behind the ritual is even stranger, because the hymn is not describing hunger. Inside the pyramid texts, consuming the gods symbolized absorbing divine power. It is describing absorption. The Egyptians believed divine power could move through ritual. Strength, authority, sacred energy, and eternal life were not abstract ideas to them. These were real forces woven into the structure of existence itself. And according to the Cannibal Hymn, the dead king intended to take those forces into himself, completely. That is why the text keeps emphasizing organs, hearts, and inner power. The heart was not just flesh in Egyptian belief. It carried intelligence, memory, identity, and spiritual force. Consuming the heart of a divine being symbolized absorbing what made that being powerful in the first place. The Cannibal Hymn describes the ancient Egyptian afterlife like a royal slaughterhouse. And somehow, that line still does not fully capture how strange this chapter of the hymn becomes. Because throughout the ritual, the king continues changing. At the start of the journey, Unas was still recognizable as a dead ruler seeking immortality. By this point, he feels closer to a force moving through the cosmos itself. The text describes him growing stronger, with every divine being consumed, more radiant, more feared, more eternal. The gods themselves begin losing individuality as their powers are folded into the king. Their strength becomes his strength. Their magic becomes his magic. Their eternity becomes his eternity. And what makes this even more disturbing is that the hymn never presents the act as evil. It is sacred, necessary. The priests who carved these words believed the transformation protected the king from weakness, decay, and annihilation. In their eyes, this was not chaos. It was survival raised to a divine level. You can almost imagine the atmosphere inside the burial chamber as priests recited these utterances during royal funerary rites. Oil lamps flickering against walls covered in hieroglyphs, smoke curling through narrow corridors beneath the pyramid. The body of the king lying silent in darkness, while the ritual words transformed him into something the living could barely comprehend. Not merely immortal, invulnerable. Let me explain why the Cannibal Hymn feels so ancient even compared to other Egyptian religious texts. Most later funerary traditions focus on moral judgment, safe passage, and harmony with cosmic order. The Cannibal Hymn feels older than that, more primal. A world where immortality belonged only to the strong enough to seize it. And scattered throughout the hymn are flashes of imagery that still unsettle historians today. Gods trembling before the king. The oldest divine beings burned beneath cauldrons. Celestial fires rising into the heavens. Invisible powers transferred through sacred consumption. At moments, the text almost stops feeling religious altogether. It feels mythic in the oldest sense of the word, raw human fear transformed into ritual. Because beneath all the violence, one truth keeps surfacing again and again. The king is terrified of becoming powerless after death. Everything in the hymn flows from that fear. The hunt, the slaughter, the consumption, the transformation. All of it points toward a single, desperate goal: never becoming weak again. And perhaps that is why later generations of Egyptians seemed uncomfortable with this text. Some later pyramid inscriptions reused parts of the Cannibal Hymn, but nothing quite this extreme survived in mainstream funerary religion afterward. It is almost as if later Egypt slowly stepped away from the terrifying vision hidden inside Unus's pyramid. But the hymn itself survived. Waiting beneath the desert, for thousands of years. And even today, there are moments where it still feels disturbingly modern. Because the idea at its center is not really about cannibalism. It is about what people are willing to become in order to escape oblivion. That is why the imagery lingers in the mind long after reading it. Not because it is graphic, because it feels psychologically true. The dead king is no longer asking whether he deserves eternity. He is taking it. And then the hymn reveals the final stage of the transformation. Because after consuming the bodies of the gods, the king begins consuming something far more valuable: their divine essence, their hidden power, their very existence. And then, the king consumed something far more important than flesh. Chapter 5. The gods were meant to be consumed. By the time the Cannibal Hymn reaches its final transformation, the dead king is no longer recognizable as human. The hunt is over. The rituals are complete. The gods have been captured, prepared, and consumed. But the hymn makes something very clear. The bodies were never the true prize. The real goal was power. Hidden inside ancient Egyptian religion was a sacred force called Heka. And understanding Heka changes the entire meaning of the Cannibal Hymn. Today, people often translate Heka as magic, but that word barely captures what the Egyptians believed it truly was. Heka was not illusion, not stage tricks, not fantasy. It was a living force woven into existence itself. The power that moved the stars, the force that allowed gods to create. The energy hidden inside sacred words, rituals, names, bloodlines, and divine beings. Even the gods depended on it. And according to the Cannibal Hymn, Unas was taking that force into himself. This is why the text feels so unsettling once you begin understanding its deeper symbolism. The king wasn't eating bodies. In the Cannibal Hymn, Pharaoh Unas was devouring divine existence itself. That is the moment the hymn stops feeling merely violent and becomes philosophical in a deeply uncomfortable way. Because the dead king is not satisfied with surviving death. He wants absolute security against it, total cosmic authority. The hymn describes him absorbing the strength of divine beings, one after another, until the boundaries between king and god begin collapsing entirely. Some translations describe Unas swallowing the wisdom of older gods. Others suggest he consumes their sacred fire, their power of speech, their authority over the heavens themselves. Every act of consumption becomes transformation. Every transformation makes him harder to destroy. And slowly, a terrifying possibility begins emerging from the text. What if immortality alone was not enough for the ancient Egyptians? What if eternity without power still meant vulnerability? That fear seems to echo through every line of the hymn. Because in Egyptian belief, the afterlife was not passive. The dead still faced dangers, hostile spirits, chaotic forces, divine judgment, the possibility of spiritual weakness. Even the sun god Ra had to battle darkness every night as he crossed the underworld. Existence itself was fragile. And perhaps that is why the king needed more than survival. He needed dominance. The visuals inside the hymn become almost cosmic during these passages. Glowing organs filled with divine force, sacred fire entering the king's body, the heavens themselves reacting as Unas grows more powerful, stars bending around him, celestial beings shrinking before him. At moments, it feels less like a resurrection and more like the birth of a new cosmic entity, a being assembled from the powers of the gods themselves. And yet, the text still treats this transformation as sacred. That may be the most disturbing detail of all. Nobody inside the pyramid questions whether the king should possess this power. The priests encourage it. The rituals support it. The gods themselves become resources to be consumed for the survival of the ruler. Some Egyptologists believe these ideas may preserve traces of extremely ancient royal theology, where the king stood above ordinary humanity in terrifying ways. Others argue the Cannibal Hymn uses exaggerated symbolic language to express divine union with the cosmos. But neither explanation fully removes the strange, emotional weight of the text, because even symbolically, the meaning remains intense. Unas is absorbing immortality itself, and the hymn repeatedly emphasizes permanence. The king cannot weaken, cannot decay, cannot disappear. His power grows so immense that the stars themselves become part of his identity. Some lines suggest he moves among the imperishable stars, the circumpolar constellations that never set beneath the horizon. To the Egyptians, these eternal stars represented something death could never touch. Unas is no longer simply entering their realm, he is becoming one of them. This may explain why the Cannibal Hymn still unsettles modern audiences more than many other ancient myths. Most mythologies draw a line between humanity and divine power. The Cannibal Hymn erases that line completely. The dead king takes what belongs to the gods, consumes it, absorbs it, becomes something beyond ordinary creation. And beneath all of this lies a deeply human fear. The fear that weakness leads to annihilation, that vulnerability invites destruction, that death can only be escaped by becoming powerful enough to resist it forever. In many ways, the Cannibal Hymn feels less like a story about cannibalism and more like a story about obsession. An obsession with permanence, with control, with never again being at the mercy of forces greater than yourself. That idea still feels strangely modern. Even today, humanity searches constantly for ways to defeat aging, extend life, preserve memory, escape death, and hold power over time itself. The language changes, the technology changes, but the fear underneath remains familiar. And maybe that is why Unas still feels unsettling after 4,000 years. Because hidden beneath the ancient rituals is a question that never truly disappeared. How far would a person go to ensure they could never be erased? By this point in the hymn, the king has become something the living can barely describe. The heavens fear him, the gods empower him, the stars accept him. But there is still one mystery left unresolved. Why did Egyptian religion create a vision of the afterlife this extreme in the first place? Why would a civilization obsessed with order, balance, and sacred harmony imagine a dead king consuming divine power like a cosmic predator? That answer may lie not in the gods themselves, but in the deepest fear ancient Egypt ever carried. But why did Egyptians believe a king needed this much power after death? Chapter 6. Egypt's greatest fear, Oblivion. For all its violence, the Cannibal Hymn is ultimately built around fear. Not hunger, not cruelty, fear. And once you understand what the ancient Egyptians feared most, the entire pyramid begins to feel different. Because to them, death itself was not the true horror. The real horror was ceasing to exist. For the ancient Egyptians, dying was not the worst outcome. Being forgotten was. That fear shaped nearly every ritual in ancient Egypt. Their pyramids, their tombs, their statues, their rituals. Even the careful preservation of the dead body through mummification came from the desperate need to remain whole after death. The Egyptians believed a person was made from multiple spiritual parts: the body, the soul, the name, the life force, the shadow. All of these elements needed to survive together if someone hoped to continue existing in the afterlife. If one part failed, the entire self could collapse. That is why names were carved endlessly into stone, why offerings were left inside tombs, why priests repeated sacred words over the dead generation after generation. Because memory itself had power. To erase someone's name was not merely disrespect. It was a form of annihilation. And hidden beneath the Cannibal Hymn is the terror of that annihilation. The king does not seek divine power because he is evil. He seeks it because weakness means vulnerability. Vulnerability means destruction. And destruction means oblivion. You can almost feel this fear in the architecture of Egypt itself. Abandoned tombs beneath drifting sand, broken statues with faces deliberately destroyed, ancient names worn smooth by time until no one remembers who once ruled there. To modernize, these ruins feel beautiful. To the Egyptians, they would have felt horrifying. A warning that eternity could fail. One of the most important ideas in ancient Egyptian afterlife belief was becoming an Ak. An Ak was not simply a ghost. It was a fully transformed spirit, powerful, effective, eternal, able to exist among the divine forces of the cosmos. Becoming an Ak meant succeeding after death. But failure was possible. A spirit could become trapped, lost, hungry, forgotten. Some funerary texts even describe souls wandering helplessly in darkness, unable to speak, unable to eat, unable to remember themselves. That possibility haunted the Egyptian imagination for thousands of years. And perhaps nowhere is the desperation to avoid that fate more visible than inside Unas's pyramid. Because once you strip away the terrifying imagery of divine hunts and celestial slaughter, the Cannibal Hymn reveals something surprisingly human beneath it. Panic. A king refusing to become powerless. A civilization trying to solve death through ritual, magic, and transformation. The Cannibal Hymn is desperation hidden beneath power. That may be why the text still feels emotionally disturbing today. Not because most people believe in ancient Egyptian theology anymore, but because the fear underneath it remains familiar. Nobody wants to disappear. Nobody wants their identity erased. Nobody wants to become forgotten by time itself. And ancient Egypt understood how fragile memory really was. Entire dynasties vanished, tombs collapsed, priests died, languages changed, even the names of gods faded across centuries. The Egyptians watched oblivion happen constantly around them. Perhaps that is why the king in the Cannibal Hymn becomes so extreme. He is not merely trying to survive death, he is trying to become untouchable by it. That is an important difference. The hymn does not ask the gods to protect Unas forever. It transforms Unas into something powerful enough to protect himself. That may explain why the tone of the text feels so different from later Egyptian religion. Later funerary traditions often focused more on moral judgment, balance, and peaceful passage into the afterlife. But the Cannibal Hymn feels older, more brutal, closer to a world where survival belonged only to those strong enough to seize it. Some scholars believe this may preserve echoes of prehistoric beliefs older than the Egyptian state itself. A memory from an age when kingship and divinity were tied directly to domination, sacred violence, and cosmic survival. Whether or not that theory is true, the emotional core of the hymn remains the same: fear of erasure. And the more historians studied the pyramid texts, the stranger this realization became. Because the Cannibal Hymn was not hidden accidentally. The priests carved it carefully into the burial chamber itself, protected it, preserved it, repeated it, as if they genuinely believed these words could alter the fate of the dead king. Imagine standing alone inside those narrow chambers beneath Saqqara. Torchlight fading against ancient stone. Hieroglyphs stretching endlessly through the darkness. The silence so complete, it almost feels alive. And surrounding you, on every wall, are desperate instructions teaching a king how to survive forever. Not peacefully, not gently, but by becoming something greater than death itself. That is why the Cannibal Hymn continues to fascinate people today. Because beneath all its cosmic horror lies one of the oldest human fears ever recorded. The fear that one day, everything we are could vanish completely. That fear appears across countless ancient Egyptian funerary texts, but nowhere more violently than the Cannibal Hymn of Unas. And perhaps that fear also explains something else. Why later generations of Egyptians slowly moved away from texts like this. Why the Cannibal Hymn began feeling too ancient, too violent, too dangerous. Almost like a sacred memory, civilization itself no longer wanted to look at directly. And that fear may explain why this hymn became too disturbing for later generations. Chapter 7. Why Egypt hid the Cannibal Hymn. The deeper historians studied the Cannibal Hymn, the stranger one question became. Why did Egyptian religion move away from texts like this? Because the hymn did not completely disappear after Unas. Fragments of it survived in later funerary writings. Certain lines echoed across centuries. Parts of the pyramid texts evolved into coffin texts and eventually influenced the Book of the Dead. That means the pyramid of Pharaoh Unas may preserve the earliest surviving roots of later Egyptian afterlife traditions. But the raw intensity of the Cannibal Hymn slowly faded from Egyptian religious tradition. The violent cosmic hunt, the devouring of gods, the terrifying transformation of the king into something almost beyond divinity itself. Those ideas became less central over time. And that raises a fascinating possibility. Even in ancient Egypt, the Cannibal Hymn may have felt ancient. That idea has fascinated generations of scholars, trying to understand what exactly the Cannibal Hymn represents. Was it symbolic, political, ritualistic? Or was it preserving fragments of an older religious world, already fading by the time Unas ruled Egypt? Modern Egyptologists still debate what the Cannibal Hymn truly meant inside ancient Egyptian religion. James P. Allen, one of the leading translators of the pyramid texts, approached the hymn as part of a larger system of royal resurrections theology. In this interpretation, the terrifying imagery represents the king absorbing divine power in order to join the eternal cosmic order. Not literal cannibalism, transformation. But even symbolic readings do not fully remove the unsettling tone of the text, because the symbolism itself is aggressive. The king dominates the gods rather than serving them. That detail remains unusual in Egyptian religion. Miriam Lichtheim, whose translations introduced many readers to the Cannibal Hymn, emphasized how dramatically different these passages feel compared to later funerary literature. Her work helped reveal just how archaic and violent the imagery truly was. Then there is Raymond O. Faulkner, whose translations preserved much of the raw atmosphere of the original utterances. Reading Faulkner's versions, even today, feels unsettling because the language remains so direct. The gods are hunted, prepared, consumed. The heavens tremble before the king. Nothing is softened. And because of that, some historians began exploring another possibility entirely. What if the Cannibal Hymn preserves memories from a much older stage of religion? Not the polished temple traditions most people associate with ancient Egypt, but something more tribal, more primal. A sacred worldview shaped by survival, dominance, and divine kingship in its earliest forms. There are hints supporting this idea. Many ancient cultures connected ritual consumption with absorbing spiritual power. Hunting symbolism appears across early religions around the world. Sacred feasting, divine inheritance, and ceremonial violence often existed long before organized priesthoods refined them into more structured belief systems. The Cannibal Hymn may preserve echoes of that older world. A world where the king's survival after death depended not on moral purity, but on raw cosmic strength. Other scholars disagree entirely. Some believe the hymn functioned primarily as ritual performance, dramatic sacred language intended to overwhelm the imagination and magnify royal authority during funerary ceremonies. In this interpretation, the terrifying imagery was not meant to be taken literally at all. Instead, it projected the king's supremacy across the cosmos itself. A kind of divine propaganda carved into stone. And perhaps that explanation is just as unsettling, because it means the priests intentionally created a vision of the afterlife where the king surpassed even the gods. That would have reinforced royal power at the highest possible level. Not merely political authority over Egypt, cosmic authority over existence itself. But regardless of interpretation, one truth remains difficult to ignore. The Cannibal Hymn feels emotionally different from most surviving Egyptian religious texts. There is a rawness to it, a kind of ancient desperation. And maybe later generations sensed that too. As Egyptian civilization evolved, religion became increasingly focused on balance, morality, judgment, and harmony with Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. The Cannibal Hymn belongs to a different emotional world, one where eternity feels uncertain, dangerous, violent. A world where immortality must be seized rather than granted. That may explain why later funerary traditions gradually softened many of these themes. Not because the hymn was forgotten, but because civilization itself was changing. The older vision of divine kingship may have started feeling too extreme, too primitive, possibly even dangerous. And yet the text survived, buried beneath the sands at Saqqara for thousands of years, waiting for modern eyes to rediscover it, waiting for archaeologists to step into those silent chambers and uncover one of the oldest spiritual fears humanity ever recorded. And perhaps the strangest part of all is this. Despite being over 4,000 years old, the Cannibal Hymn still feels strangely modern in one specific way. Because deep beneath all the rituals, violence, and cosmic symbolism lies a question people still struggle with today. What happens when the fear of death becomes stronger than the fear of becoming monstrous? That question may be the real reason the hymn continues haunting people long after they first hear it. But there's one final reason the Cannibal Hymn still unsettles people today. Chapter 8. The darkest vision of ancient Egypt. There is a reason the Cannibal Hymn still feels disturbing today. Not just strange, not just violent, disturbing. Because even after thousands of years, the text touches something modern audiences still instinctively fear. The possibility that surviving at any cost might slowly transform a person into something unrecognizable. That idea sits at the center of the hymn, like a shadow hidden beneath all the rituals and divine imagery. By the end of the transformation, Unas is no longer simply a dead king. He has crossed a boundary. The gods fear him. The heavens rearrange around him. The stars themselves become part of his identity. And somewhere along the way, the line between ruler and predator disappears completely. The Cannibal Hymn feels disturbing because it removes the line between God and monster. That may be why so many people today describe the Cannibal Hymn as feeling strangely modern despite its age. Not modern in language, modern in psychology. Because beneath the ancient rituals lies a question that still follows humanity everywhere. What happens when the fear of death becomes stronger than morality itself? The deeper you look into the hymn, the more it starts resembling something closer to cosmic horror than traditional mythology. Not horror built around ghosts or violence alone. Cosmic horror. The fear of becoming insignificant inside an enormous and hostile universe. The fear that survival might require surrendering part of your humanity. The fear that immortality itself could become monstrous. Long before modern horror writers imagined humans confronting terrifying cosmic forces, the Cannibal Hymn was already describing a king devouring divine power beneath the stars. The Cannibal Hymn of Pharaoh Unas was already describing cosmic predation inside the ancient Egyptian afterlife. And unlike many later myths, there is almost no comfort inside the story. No moral lesson, no promise that goodness triumphs in the end. Only transformation, consumption, ascension. A king refusing to vanish. That ancient rawness is part of what makes the text feel so different from later religious traditions. Many later belief systems place limits on power. They divide gods from mortals. They establish moral boundaries around what should never be crossed. The Cannibal Hymn barely acknowledges those boundaries at all. Instead, it asks something much darker. If absolute power could protect you from death forever, would you take it? That question echoes through nearly every image in the pyramid. The glowing organs filled with divine force, the celestial fires beneath the heavens, the king swallowing the strength of the gods, the stars moving like living witnesses above him. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the silence afterward. Because once the transformation is complete, Unas stands alone. The hunt is over. The rituals are finished. The gods have been consumed. And the king enters eternity, carrying all their power within himself. You can almost picture the final image the priests wanted the dead ruler to imagine. An endless sky without limits. Silent stars surrounding the king forever. No weakness. No decay. No fear of disappearance ever again. But also, no return. No humanity left untouched. Only eternity. That feeling is what makes the Cannibal Hymn linger in the mind long after hearing it. The text never directly says the king became evil, but it quietly suggests that escaping death required becoming something beyond ordinary human understanding. And that idea appears again and again throughout mythology across the world. Transformation myths, forbidden knowledge, mortals seeking immortality and paying for it with their humanity. The Cannibal Hymn may be one of the oldest surviving versions of that story ever recorded. Even the setting itself contributes to the feeling. Unlike many myths passed down through generations of storytellers, the Cannibal Hymn survived buried inside an actual pyramid. Real chambers, real stone, real hieroglyphs carved more than 4,000 years ago. That changes how the story feels psychologically. Because somewhere beneath the sands of Saqqara, people genuinely believed these rituals mattered. They believed these words could transform a dead king into an eternal cosmic force. And perhaps that is why the story still unsettles historians. Not because ancient people imagined strange things, every civilization does that, but because the Cannibal Hymn reveals a version of humanity stripped down to one overwhelming instinct: survive. Survive, even if the cost is terrifying. Survive, even if the heavens themselves must be consumed. At moments, the text almost feels less like religion and more like a mirror, reflecting one of humanity's oldest obsessions. The same dream that appears throughout ancient Egyptian mythology and funerary belief. Even today, that obsession still shapes the modern world. People search constantly for longer life, stronger bodies, preserved memory, digital immortality, artificial intelligence capable of outliving human minds. The language has changed, the technology has changed, but the fear underneath remains almost identical. Nobody wants to disappear. And perhaps that is why Una still feels strangely close, despite the distance of thousands of years. Because hidden beneath the rituals, beneath the cosmic violence, beneath the terrifying transformation, there is still a human being standing in the dark, refusing to accept oblivion. That may be the final secret of the Cannibal Hymn. It was never truly about eating gods. It was about defeating powerlessness, defeating fear, defeating death itself. And yet, even after all the translations, debates, and discoveries, the mystery never fully disappears. Because the deeper people study the hymn, the harder it becomes to answer one final question. Did the ancient Egyptians see this transformation as horrifying or glorious? And when archaeologists finally stepped back out into the desert sun, the question still remained. Epilogue: The King Who Refused to Die. After everything hidden inside the pyramid of Unas, the question still remains. Was he really meant to be understood as a cannibal king? Probably not in the literal sense modern audiences imagine. There is no evidence ancient Egyptian religion practiced literal, ritual cannibalism, the way sensational stories sometimes claim. The Cannibal Hymn was never describing ordinary hunger. It was describing transformation, spiritual, symbolic, cosmic. In the Cannibal Hymn, the king consumes the gods because he is absorbing their divine authority and immortality. Power, immortality, divine authority. The strength to survive forever. And perhaps, most importantly of all, freedom from fear. That changes the meaning of the hymn completely. Because once the symbolism becomes clear, the real horror no longer comes from the act of consumption itself. It comes from what drove the king to seek that power in the first place. The terror of ceasing to exist. That fear lives beneath every chamber of the pyramid, every ritual, every carved hieroglyph, every desperate prayer for permanence. And in the Cannibal Hymn, that fear reaches its most extreme form imaginable. A ruler refusing to trust even the gods with his survival. A king deciding eternity could only be guaranteed if he became stronger than death itself. That is why the text still feels forbidden in a strange way. Not because it is simply violent, but because it reveals a form of religion stripped down to survival at any cost. A world before morality became the center of spiritual life. A world where cosmic order was dangerous, fragile, and uncertain. A world where immortality belonged to whoever possessed enough power to seize it. That ancient mindset still lingers in the atmosphere of the pyramid. Even today, archaeologists walking through the burial chambers of Unas describe the strange feeling of standing inside those narrow corridors beneath tons of stone and silence. The hieroglyphs still cover the walls, exactly where priests carved them more than 4,000 years ago. The passages still descend into darkness. The king still waits beneath the earth. And surrounding him are the words meant to transform him forever. Perhaps that is why the Cannibal Hymn continues haunting modern audiences more than many other ancient myths. Because it forces people to confront a possibility that feels deeply human. That fear itself can reshape belief. That the terror of oblivion can transform even sacred ideas into something frightening. And maybe that is exactly what happened inside Unas's pyramid. The priests were not trying to create evil. They were trying to defeat annihilation, trying to ensure their king would never fade, never weaken, never disappear into the darkness, waiting beyond death. The methods they imagined were extreme, but the fear behind them remains familiar even now. Humanity still searches for permanence, still fears aging, still struggles against death, still dreams of preserving memory forever. The symbols change across time, but the longing underneath them remains almost identical. And perhaps that is the final reason the Cannibal Hymn survives in the imagination long after hearing it. Because beneath the celestial hunts, the divine slaughter, the consuming of gods, and the terrifying ascent into the heavens, there is still something painfully human hidden at the center of the story. A man standing against oblivion, refusing to be erased. In the end, Unas may not have been remembered because of conquest, empire, or glory. He survived because his pyramid preserved one of humanity's oldest recorded nightmares, and also one of its oldest desires: to live forever. Inside that silent pyramid, the oldest fear in human history was carved into stone. The fear that death might erase us forever. Thank you for spending this time in the shadow of ancient Egypt. If you want more forgotten myths, ancient horrors, and lost religious mysteries, subscribe and let me know which myth we should descend into next. Until next time, yours, Lady Mythos.